Today's guest is Chris Fussell, president of McChrystal Group, a consultancy that helps organizations tap into the potential of their people to better compete in a complex and interconnected business environment. Chris is the author of the 2015 New York Times bestseller, Team of Teams, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World, as well as a 2017 Wall Street Journal bestseller, One Mission, How Leaders Build a Team of Teams. He joined McChrystal Group as a partner in 2012. Prior to that, Chris served for 15 years in the Navy on U.S. Navy SEAL teams, leading SEAL elements in combat zones around the globe. Chris lives with his family in the DC area. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
So, Chris, we're really excited to dive in with you today. You have a really different background than any guest we've had on the show to date. You spent your first 15 years of your career in the military. Thank you for your service. I would love if we could actually start just from the beginning. Give our listeners some background. Where'd you grow up? What motivated you to join the service? And what brought you to McChrystal Group?
Yeah, the short version is grew up in a little bit of a military family. My dad was in the special forces. I have an uncle who's in SEAL teams, brother in SEAL teams. And so I was just sort of naturally drawn to, that idea. But I joined at a time where the world was going through this pretty dramatic shift. Late 90s, after college, ended up in the Navy, specifically to go in the SEAL teams. And then obviously 2001, the world just sort of turns upside down. And the special operations community found itself right at the forefront of the new battlefield. At its core, what we came to recognize at that point in my career, I was in a specific set of units that was focused on counterterrorism. And so a very, very, a small sliver of the broad military, but it had a very specific task and had for generations. And it was at that point led by General Stan McChrystal, who's now my partner and good friend for years. And he was the first leader that I saw in the military in that new environment to say, I don't think we have the right structures in place to be able to compete in the information age, right? We don't move information quickly enough. We don't make decisions on the front edge of the organization well. We're really good at precision strike. If I tell you what to do and give you the stuff you need, I know you're going to do it well. But we have to do a lot more with the same amount of resources and personnel that we have, and we're not keeping pace with the rate of change. And so I was very fortunate to be in that part of the service for about a decade, while Stan McChrystal and other senior leaders were sort of guiding it through this massive transformation, which we can dive into more. And that's obviously what led to my relationship with Stan and our friendship over the years. And when he retired and started McChrystal Group, I was fast on his heels because I thought this was such a unique time in history to be able to bring these lessons from the battlefield over into industry and other areas that are obviously wrestling with these same issues. How quickly the world changes. The last 8 or 9 months are an acute example of that, but this trend has been going on for I would argue 20 or 30 years now. And we were late to the game in the military. We had to figure it out on the fly, and a lot of organizations are going through the same struggle. So that's what got me into the group and has kept me here for nearly a decade now.
And Chris, you guys have this concept you call Agile at scale. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know what, growing up in the military, what the concept of Agile and that sort of Scrum methodology, those approaches, which are brilliant, make a ton of sense, what they were. We didn't use that language when I was in the SEAL teams. But now as consultants who was also in the special operations community, it's essentially the same way that you would structure a SEAL platoon that would be 16 or 20 folks and a SEAL team, which is about 5 or 6 of those bolted together. So still relatively small numbers when you think of big organizations. And the way, if you went into a mission planning cycle for as a SEAL platoon, it's like, let's say 20 people in a combat zone, you would get directions, say, hey, we've got this problem. We're going to give it to, Alpha platoon, go figure it out. And the leaders would quickly get everybody together and say, here's what we're looking at. Go figure out your component parts. Here, the end state we want to reach is X, and let's resynchronize in an hour. We'd come together, talk about it, then decentralize again, come back an hour later, et cetera, et cetera. And so you go through these fast iterative cycles, and you're on a very tight timeline because the helicopters have to be up, an hour after sundown. And so you're in this sort of very agile mentality of how you're developing your plan and approach, et cetera, and you're resynchronizing to get new information, et cetera. And so and you see that sort of small team dynamic definitely in the tech space where, the development space has been thinking about like that for quite a while, and now it's spreading out into other parts of industry. One of the issues that McChrystal, we didn't use the term agile. What he started to say was, we're incredibly effective and fast and decentralized at the small team level, which is sort of another way of saying agile. How do we scale that up into the global enterprise? Because he was overseeing 25,000 people all around the world in a very, very complex environment. And I need that same level of small team behavior spread across the globe. And so he started asking, what are the drivers that make those small teams so successful? We share information well. We trust one another because we have deep personal relationships with each other. We maintain a constant alignment on mission from the moment you get the task until the moment you're landing back at the base after the mission's done. Everybody is crystal clear on what they're trying to accomplish. So those sorts of behaviors and cultural norms at the small team is what he said. If we can scale that up to 10,000, 20,000 people around the globe, then we'll be able to harness the strength and stability of this large organization that myself and the leadership run in this sort of traditional sense, and layer in the very dynamic and agile approach that happens inside our small units. And it wasn't easy through sort of a very disciplined change in process and cultural examples being set from our leadership that underscored the importance of relationships and trust, et cetera. Eventually he got there. And so, in hindsight, we sort of simplify that long explanation down into imagine agile at scale. And that just resonates with a lot of people that have been taking that approach for years now in the small team way.
And making that transition, this an incredible transition to make, especially for such a large organization, and especially where stakes are so high. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the stumbling blocks in doing that? As other people think about trying to make their organizations more agile, maybe you can go back in the rewind machine and talk a little bit about areas where there was some big learnings in that transition.
Yeah, I get asked this question all the time. What's the difference between, sort of, you didn't say it like this, but the military trying to change and industry trying to change, the dynamics of leadership, cultural norms, et cetera. And the answer is they're far more similar than different, right? And the military has, it's this, for good reason, well-respected institution in our country. But in some ways, I think misunderstood or perhaps even over-aggrandized. Like, well, if you tell a bunch of SEALs what to do, they're just going to do it, right? Well, no, that's actually not true at all, right? They're going to challenge you. They're going to ask you why. They're going to want to know the underlying reasons, et cetera, just like you would in a very competitive industry, right? So it's not like out of the movies where, the 3-star general just gives orders and everybody executes, right? And so much like industry, one of the first stumbling blocks was an underappreciation of the human capital side of this, right? It's not enough just to identify, and we were fortunate to have the right senior leader in Stan McChrystal and others around him that had a human EQ to be able to read the situation relatively fast, but they had to get in there and say, okay, here's the problem as I see it, but I also need to now create buy-in. I need to circulate this idea and learn from those on the ground and create some common narrative that all of us believe in as to why this problem is so much harder. The first time I ever met Stan McChrystal face-to-face was the first time I was deployed with those units you ever saw. Myself, half a dozen other folks sitting at a little, outstation on the edge of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he flew in with his intelligence officer, and half a dozen of us sat around in a little plywood hut, and he, on a little flip chart, started to just diagram what he saw as the problem, right? I think we're structured like this, big top-down structure, very, very efficient and precise. But over here we have these sort of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, other networks that aren't centrally controlled. They're just sort of based on familial connections and a common ideology, et cetera. They do things faster than us. So do you see it the same? How do these things interact with each other here in your battle space? And so what turned from what would have normally been like a junior officer briefing the general turned into a very interactive discussion. And he was doing that all around the battlefield to try to overcome that human dynamic that can get in the way of change, even when change makes sense. I think that was probably the biggest challenge, but also the smartest decision that our leadership made out of the gates to say, I'm going to move slow to move fast, right? I have to spend 4, 5, 6 months deepening my understanding of this problem, but I'm going to deepen it through conversation with those that are actually at the edge of the organization. And then when I roll out what I think is the right next move, it will be much more refined and informed, but my organization will also see themselves in it, right? Because we've had these conversations. So we always really encourage senior leadership. Hey, just because you can identify the problem and your solution is right, doesn't mean you'll be able to get there, right? You got to build a bridge out of the human capital in your organization to be able to get across that divide. So that was a real similarity between those two spaces.
That's fascinating. It sounds like, I mean, the things that I heard there was really eliciting feedback from the edges and enrolling people in kind of a shared vision, as well as like ensuring that there's not bottlenecks to like the normal flow of information in a classic hierarchy. Is that?
No, you're exactly right. And what we have eventually became, and the model that we really believe in now is, because there's a lot of discussion in sort of the org design space and what's technology doing to us in big organizations, et cetera, where it becomes this binary discussion where, well, in the old times we use these org charts and, you were the boss and you had, et cetera. And that's a way of the past, right? And we've got to move beyond that. And on the other side, there's this, no one has a title. We're leaderless. We form ourselves organically into little pods of excellence. And that's the best way to harness the talent and drive a meaningful culture. Well, on the one side, you've got this super stable, structured thing. I mean, there's a reason that bureaucracy exists, right? Because it works really well at what it's supposed to be doing. But it's slow, it's painful, it can be frustrating. It doesn't work well against fast-moving competitors, but you can control the heck out of it, right? There's a reason it's been around for thousands of years. On those more network dynamics, we've been in 30 years, this massive shift, right? Networks aren't new. They're as old as hierarchy and older in many cases, right? That's just the way humans interact. What's changed in the last 30 years is how big it can scale, right? Normally, your network connectivity was dependent on how many people you could see and touch, et cetera. Now you can do it remotely. So your network dynamic can scale well beyond the traditional Dunbar's number of 120 or so into, we faced a network threat of tens of thousands because it was just receiving a story constantly from its major and important nodes. And no one anticipated that problem. That said, while it's scalable, it's quick, et cetera, now very dynamic, it's hard to control, right? It fractions off. There's no centralized strategy. It's very inefficient, right? You can't, there's no supply chain that's organized, et cetera. So it's really a combination of those two that's critical. I like to think of it as just a hybrid structure. Maintain that strength and stability of a hierarchy where it makes sense, which can be a lot of those big major lines of effort in an organization that if they go wrong, like somebody's going to go to jail, right? The FCC is going to show up. I mean, these are major things that have to, in the military, that would have been like our supply chain. You can run around the battlefield, but don't mess with the supply chain, right? Because if that big gray aircraft doesn't show up on time, and there's no food or water, everything else falls apart, right? So allow those things that are traditional to remain there and solve them through efficiency and more normal business practices. Layer in communication and cultural practices that allow you to be dynamic where and when that makes sense. It's the coupling of those two that really is, both in our experience there and what we've seen happening in industry, if you can unlock that, it really sets conditions to be successful in this information age transition that we're in right now.
It's been such a fascinating thing to watch. I just want to make one more question, but to have you advance, Adam. So the observation that I would have is that these kind of norms and the way in which centralized organization, kind of lumbering giants operate, whether it's military or large corporations, they are very stable, very controllable, and they've worked for a long period of time. And the only reason that they change is if there's a forcing function, right? And so like what you were describing is kind of the forcing function of the battlefield changing and it needing something radically new. And I think some of what we've seen this year is like these large companies that are highly centralized and put butts in seats in one office, and have this like standardized, like completely linear supply chains. COVID has just completely, thrown that into a tailspin. And what used to be, I would say, like what used to be control and excellence now kind of like what it did, it was kind of expose the problems of that for large enterprises. I'm curious to get your perspective on maybe what you've seen for large enterprises, this kind of forcing function of COVID and what impacts it's had on large enterprises.
Yeah, if by no means should any of us underestimate the stresses of this year, and what it's put so many families through and the economics of it, et cetera. On the backside of this, I tend to be a long-term optimist on anything involving humanity, right? So what are the things we're learning from this? Because it has been such a trial by fire. In the 10-year window, I think we've accelerated a lot of thinking, right? Around, you can't just be dependent on that one system, because it is, it's all the whole anti-fragile argument, right? If it's the ultimate huge, stable, but fragile thing, right? And we just it hit an earthquake, right? And so if that was the only way you had things, only way you were structured to run your business, you've probably learned some really hard lessons, right? One observation I would say at the front end of this, organizations that go into a state of chaos either go away quickly, and we certainly saw some of that in the market, in the first 3 or 4 months of this. Some surprises in there, legacy organizations, you thought, wow, that they didn't have a lot of cash on hand to be able to make it through this. Others that have gone into a state of sort of, a bowl of spaghetti, right? All these communication pathways that open up, right? Those that have come through and survived, that were in the traditional model, that went into that model of really like, let's just all start interacting and solve this. They tend to get a performance spike, right? And we heard a lot of that after the first 3 or 4 months of this. We're actually getting a lot more done than we ever have. Well, we have, sure. I mean, there's a very, very common enemy right now. Everybody's fighting for their own, there's survival of them and their families, and for the business that supports that. But now as things normalize, this is where the real question mark comes in. I think organizations that, those that are fighting to get back to spring of 2019, it's not going to come, right? There's going to be some sort of hybrid existence for the next 5-6 years. And by that point, you've rewired behavior, right? And so you will have onboarded new employees that have worked in this sort of mode of business for the first 2 or 3 cycles of their career. There's no going back to what it looked like in 2019. That's okay. Think about how are you going to react and adjust yourself? What are the benefits you've gotten out of this much communication and connectivity and the decentralized authorities you've had to put in place? Which of those do you want to save and harness, and how are you going to do that? And which can you then go to your organization and say, hey, look, as things stabilize, we do need to get a slightly better and more efficient control on supply chain. It's been total chaos for a year. We can't live like that forever. We are over communicating. And I know you're all working 8 hours on Saturday and 9 hours on Sunday and who knows what during the week. We do want to back that off, right? Because we can go back to some sort of normalcy. So really thoughtful leaders that I'm seeing are having that conversation now. How do I maintain the things that really, the intensity of this environment suddenly bubbled up? It was a great forcing function in that way for organizations to learn about themselves, but not try to stay at this, 100-meter sprint pace for the next 5 years, which we know is unsustainable.
So Chris, I want to double tap into this theme we touched on earlier around sort of hierarchies slash bureaucracies migrating to network models, right? We're actually huge proponents of this migration as well. What we do here at Brain Trust is we are building a user-owned talent marketplace. So we connect talent, global technical talent, with big companies that desperately need them, can't hire them in-house. And we do so in a networked kind of peer-to-peer way. And so in our belief is, user-owned networks will grow faster, be more valuable than investor-owned networks. But we have the benefit of starting from scratch, right? So we can do this, and we're using technology to sort of enforce the rules and make things more decentralized and more autonomous, with technology being the guardrails. I'd be interested to see, you have such a unique perch with the McChrystal Group. How are you helping clients make this jump? How has your military experience helped this, and where does COVID play into it? Even anecdotal stories, would be interesting.
Yeah, I'll start with the military side. One of the first things that Stan McChrystal recognized was we don't really know how we operate. So we have to spend some time. I know what we look like on paper. Obviously, I'm in charge of this thing. That would be his perspective at the time. And I know if I was going to brief the Secretary of Defense and had to answer how we operate, sure, I would pull out an org chart and say, well, here's how it's. But in reality, when you took that whole nicely structured thing and put it into one space where it had to operate together, the org chart no longer really plays a role as much, right? Because it starts to self-organize around problems, and all the gaps in an org chart start to really be highlighted, because our divisions don't work well together when we're trying to solve the same problem in real time. We're very good at sending information up and having somebody make a decision and wait for it to come back down. When your problem changes 14 times before that cycle takes place, then you have to step back and say, wait a second, how are we actually operating, and how can we fix that? So that was some of that battlefield circulation that I talked about a moment ago. But diving into a deeper understanding there is key. And this maps over to our work now that I'll get to in just a moment. Once that was clearer, our leadership started to recognize we don't really have any sort of overarching narrative that pulls us together, aside from, victory or, some very high, laudy sort of term. But when you broke that down, well, I can win and you can win, and we can be at loggerheads with each other and actually in competition, right? So I'm interpreting that win descriptor or overarching goal through my own personal tribal lens. And so they pivoted that narrative to one of the collective credibility of the organization. Your mission is actually to support our entire collective credibility. And sometimes that means giving up assets. Sometimes it means sharing intelligence with another team that you might sit on for another 2 days, but they could use it right now. Those giving and taking of equities is what helped us really establish ourselves as a collective, credible organization. And so that was sort of who we are in our narrative. That then drove massive shift in communication, some of what Gabe was pointing to earlier as well. If you think about separating those two more traditional structures and a networked model into how they communicate, our leaders started to layer in, well, where things make sense to do the Monday meeting about supply chain and the Tuesday meeting about XYZ, let's keep doing that. Where we need to talk about fast changing problems on the battlefield, where we need to be more agile at scale, to the earlier point, I want to create a secondary communication structure. And so in time, we had this secondary path that was that we lived on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week cycle. So every day we would start with a 60 to 90-minute global video call that would have, just like this, but it would have 7,000 or 8,000 people on it. And it was bottom up. It was people on the front line at the edge of the organization saying, okay, here's what we learned yesterday. We did this operation. We thought it was going to go like this. The adversary adjusted like this. We think they're using a new tactic, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't a supply chain discussion. It wasn't a long-term finance discussion. It was real-time, agile thinking, what's changing around us that we need to adapt to. Then we had the remainder of that 24 hours for those teams at the front edge to operate with independence, right? So you synchronized, you were independent. You synchronized, you were independent. 7 days a week for years on end. If you did it like once a month, it would have been pointless. When we did it, the idea of doing that 7 days a week for 5-6 years straight, it seems overwhelming in hindsight. It developed very organically, but what that led to was the ability for teams on the ground to move the needle from, when things first started under McChrystal, an operation inside that organization every day or two, to 10 to 12 operations in a single night. So this, order of magnitude increase in capability with the same amount of people, right? And that level of transparency and speed in how we communicated led to the culture change that was necessary to support it. Because our leaders quickly realized, if I step into this meeting with 6,000 people, Gabe updates me, I don't like something he says, and I say, you're fired. Well, guess what happens to the next person, right? They're going to tell you whatever you want to hear, right? And so the culture had to change to one that's like, okay, that's interesting. Not super excited that happened. Why do you think that went wrong? There's got to be something in there we could all learn from. And once you had enough examples of that, and that really became the culture, people showed up to those forums, not because they were ordered to be there, because they wanted to be there to share lessons and learn from one another. Because they realized, if I'm as honest as I can be right now about what I'm seeing on my corner of the fight, Adam's going to learn something from it that he can implement tonight. And we'll be one step closer to winning and one step closer to going back to our families, right? And so there was this very, very collective mentality on how do we get each other smarter and better as fast as possible. So from that, what our practice is built around those three components. We have a network and analytics team that does deep human-to-human network analyses. We have which often informs the work we do. We have an implementation practice, which is more like traditional sort of sleeves up consulting, where you're mapping strategy to communication structures and decision-making models. And then we have an academy, McChrystal Academy, that works on that behavior shift, right? And our goal there is to consolidate into 8 to 12 months with what took us 4 to 5 years to figure out very organically.
Fascinating stuff. There's so many areas that we can dive into there.
COVID has created this sort of new dimension, new paradigm of kind of winners, losers, haves, have-nots, and some of it's been predictable. Others have been surprising. What are you guys seeing in your practice? Like, are there any interesting stories that come out, or non-intuitive stories that come out of any of your clients around sort of the impact of COVID?
Well, I could say personally, you look back at the start of this and like some of the things that happened now, like any major shift, like how did we in March, how did we not all know that was going to happen? Right. Yeah. What it's done to the tech space, what it's done to more traditional businesses, the advancements in telehealth, right? Just countless things that are just so painfully obvious 9 months later. And again, I think there's going to be some pain for us to figure out, the right and wrong of all that. But we've also advanced thinking and tech, I think, by 10 or 15 years. I think one of the pieces that we've been advocating in our practice from day one, because we grew up like this, is the idea of digital leadership. Right? In today's world, you have to be able to, and we say this because we were told this by our leaders in the military context, we had to distribute ourselves around the world. It wasn't a pandemic that did it. It was because we faced a network threat that had distributed itself. And so we couldn't sit in our headquarters and have that very sort of soldier mentality of I'm right next to my unit, right? They would say, well, there's a small problem in that corner of the world. Take 5 people and go there and figure it out. And suddenly you're away from the building and the headquarters. So this became our platform to communicate. And it was nowhere near as sophisticated then as it is now, just with, off-the-shelf tools. But our leaders made the point, you as a junior leader of an operational unit, I'm less interested in how good you are with your personal weapon system as I am interested in how good you are at this. Like, you have to be able to communicate, share information, develop relationships through digital medium. This is our new headquarters right here. And so this idea of digital leadership started to bubble up, which we've worked a lot with organizations on. And some, frankly, that, okay, but I can call Adam anytime. And what's the point of getting so many people together, right? This has forced that in such a good way. I hope that's one of the to the earlier discussion with Gabe, I hope that's one of the things that stay with us, that people say, oh, I actually can really coordinate teams remotely, and we don't have to, it's much more efficient. We want to get into this hybrid stage where we're still we're once again getting back together person to person, but it shouldn't be purely dependent on that pathway. So I think some folks that have learned those lessons and accelerated their thinking will do quite well on the backside. The other is, we've done a good amount of work with cities and states over the last year. It's not an area that we had ever actively pursued, but as soon as this hit in March, we started doing throwing anything we could out with the assumption, much like we experienced, it's going to be city leaders that are going to face the brunt of this, right? Because that's where sort of your centralization of assets around hospitals and first care, et cetera, first responders. And so as a result of that, we've done some deeper work in some cities and states around the country, and some very progressive thinking has evolved out of that. I think in some of the best leaders, party agnostic across the country, saying, okay, much like the point Gabe was making earlier, we were sort of dependent on one system for running a city or a state. What if it gets hit by multiple angles all at once, and with no end state in mind? This isn't a hurricane. It's a hurricane that's going to last for 3 years, right? And so it's not a traditional emergency response type model, which many coastal cities and some that face like wildfires in the Midwest have really good emergency response systems in place, but they're sprints, right? And they're sprints with a specific team. How do you slow that down to a marathon pace? And so I think city management, state management will be much better in the long term. I'm not so sure about national level, but I think our city and state level leaders have learned and applied really great lessons here to say, actually, this is a better way to run the system, right? Even as the battlefield has slowed down, if you look at the old units that McChrystal pivoted, they still run on the same model. They can scale the tempo up and down depending on what's going on in the world, but the cross functionality and the agility they put to the front line is still there. And I think one of the best benefits we're going to get from this is our local, how local leaders look at running their constituencies.
You touched on something that I would like to loop back on, which is what's required of leaders to run in this, I'll say like agile at scale or distributed, right? So they might be running distributed teams or moving a large organization very quickly, and doing it in a digital way versus standing up in front of a bunch of people with a whiteboard or PowerPoint or like patting people on the back around the office. So I'd love to hear your perspective and maybe some of your experience about what's required for this generation of leaders to be successful in a fully distributed environment.
Yeah, it's and the question mark there is how long will it last, right? There's a world where this is like another 2 years, right? Potentially. Now you're starting to see sort of I don't think that'll be the case. There's going to be this hybrid interplay between the two, but I think the best and most successful leaders are going to find a way to combine the two. So I don't think it will be an option not to develop this as a skill set. And it's just sort of a broad observation, but also one of the things we try to work on with organizations is in this environment, in a remote environment, because of how it's normally leveraged, and that's an overgeneralization, but much like a PowerPoint deck, right? If I get up on stage and it's like the 14 people on my team, hey, morning everybody. So here's what we're wrestling with, and I'm myself, right? I didn't even know, why are we doing that? Like, let's call that guy and make sure we square that away. Put me in front of 140 people in a PowerPoint deck. Now I'm saying, okay, good morning, everyone. Here's the update on the Smith project. And you pivot in your behavior. Some of that makes a lot of sense. This medium, in my experience, has that impact on people. There's a camera on, I'm staring at, imagery, et cetera. So I'm going to automatically snap into like a more formal mode. And as you scale it up, people want, well, if I'm going to be on camera, I need my scripted like good morning comment. Like, no, you can just say good morning. Just act like they're actually sitting in the office with you. Hey, morning, everyone. Thanks for jumping in. And the added benefit is maybe there are 3,000 people on the call, or 300 or 70. But if you're using the technology effectively, we can run multiple things all at once. I can have a chat room or a series of chat rooms going on the side. I can have, side briefers saying, "Oh, here's that report that Adam just referenced." When someone pipes in and says, "Hey, I have a question about that," her name pops up with it and her location. I can say, "Oh, let's go over to Sarah in St. Louis. Say more about that." And now you've called out a specific individual and you've given her a location inside the organization, right? So you can leverage these tools to create, as opposed to a 300-person auditorium where you're like, "Who is that in the back? I don't know. Just say whatever you're going to say," right? It can actually be more personal if you're comfortable with leveraging the tools to their fullest extent. And I mean, we saw that in our organization, and I tell this to people all the time, and I think half people previous to this pandemic didn't really get it. Now I think a lot of people do. I had great friends, and this is not unique to me, that you would at one point, 2007, 2008, years into this, you'd meet face to face, and you'd give a bear hug and ask how things are going. You'd realize, oh wow, we've never actually met in person. But you had the same level of personal connection. You had to reverse engineer and say, "No, I think I could swear I guess we never have. This is the first time physically we've been together," because we were so real with each other in this environment. But it just takes focus. It takes leaders taking it very seriously, saying, "Hey, this is your new hallway. There's no meeting after the meeting," right? As soon as you hit stop, everybody's gone, and you're not going to hear your voice again. They're not going to see your face again. You have to build those real human-to-human moments in the hour you have to discuss the topics. Where normally we'd say, "Okay, great meeting, guys." Then it breaks up, and the three of us go off to the side and catch up on the kids and how was the weekend, and you introduce me to a new person on your team. You have to find a way to do that in a remote fashion.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's we've seen some of this ourselves, which is that we've always been a fully distributed team, right? So we've never had an office, and traditionally the way you would run a company, you have a cadence of like these hour meetings that are highly structured and moving, and we've moved almost all of those to be asynchronous and written versus people just reading off their status reports or reading off the metrics that you could easily do in just reading a report and asking questions. And then we've moved to just like a one all hands per week, which gives us an ability to pivot and adjust every single week.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's in the loop about everything.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant way to do it. And one of the lessons that we learned it the hard way was forcing. I'm a big believer in using process to change behavior, right? And so rather than the other way around, you could argue both sides. But as a military person, sort of process first. How am I going to brief the senior leaders? And so if you said, "Okay, Chris, welcome to this big global organization. Tomorrow you have 6 minutes to update the senior leaders. And oh, by the way, there's going to be 6,000 people on the net." I'm hardwired to say, "Okay, I'm going to put together like 12 slides and I'm going to have a 5-minute and 58-second talk track, and they're going to move to the next briefer." And the answer you got was, because we all sort of went through that thinking, no, we have brand standards. We didn't call them brand standards, but that's what they were. You get one slide and you can only put 80 words on there, and it's got to be in these 4 quadrants. Here's the font size you have to use, et cetera. And the response was, that's not like 6 minutes worth of content. And I can't explain what's going on in my sector in like 80 words. And they would say, "No, that's exactly the point. Like you can highlight risks, opportunities, requirements, et cetera." It was like a very standard 4 block. That'll take you about 30 seconds. And then you're going to talk for 5.5 minutes. And you're going to talk based on the questions you get asked, because the senior leader is going to go, "Why do you think that's a risk? Why is that the one you highlight?" Now there's the dreaded dead air, right? Of every big meeting, like, no, you have to talk your way through it. No, it creates that opportunity for discussion. Go, "Well, here's what we're thinking. We saw it like this, and then this happened, and we're analyzing this. And that's why I think it's now the biggest risk." Okay, that's really interesting, because, I think Adam's seeing the same thing. Adam, does that align with the conversation we just had yesterday? Well, it kind of does, and now you're using the process of simplified briefing decks, et cetera, to drive a conversation. And before long, it becomes intuitive. People forget that you've walked them into that, right? And then a new person shows up and they've got like the 12 font, 5-page briefing deck, and everybody goes, no, that's not how we do things.
So Chris, switching gears a little bit here as we're on the topic of technology. This is, such an interesting topic. It comes up in multiple interviews. The role of social media in society right now. I'm maybe you've seen the new Netflix documentary, Social Dilemma. We've got an election coming up next week. The CEOs of these companies are being hauled in front of Congress on a regular basis. What do you think about sort of, your opinion on the role of these companies? Should they be regulated? What do you think should change? What do you think will change here?
Yeah, as the father of a 9-year-old and 12-year-old that still don't have devices, I have pretty strong opinions on it. I've been very fortunate since I got out of the service with the business we're in, having relationships in that sector going back, almost 10 years now. And my wife and I refer to this all the time, and very thankful that, in 2013, folks I was getting to know in that sector saying, oh no, my kids don't have devices. How old are they? They're 7 and 9. Like, okay, I'm going to follow that lead. My kids were 3 and 5, right? A year later, it'd be like, I'm still waiting. We're thinking more like 12. A year later, we're thinking 17, right? And so I've had the good fortune from learning from the folks that highlighted in Social Dilemma. They said, hey, there's something unknown going on here. I think the best line of that whole movie is, it's not just another device, right? Your bike didn't come and wake you up at 2 a.m. and say, ride me. So it is a different sort of problem that we have to get our heads around. I think, could be totally wrong, but I think in some ways I can imagine our kids, or definitely our grandchildren, looking at the way, I use this analogy sometimes. My grandfather was an OBGYN in World War II, delivered hundreds of kids, probably more, in his career. One of the weird little known secrets about that phase of that practice was they would prescribe cigarettes to pregnant women if they were worried that the child was going to be too big, right? Because they wanted to keep birth weight down, because it was such a risk before cesarean sections were common practice and well done. And I think some of the ways we'll look at what we're doing for our kids and with our kids when on these social media platforms, their children are going to say, it was like giving them cigarettes when they were 8, right? I don't think we have any idea what we're doing to where their brains are wired. And there's all sorts of excuses as to why it's makes sense. And there's certainly tons of convenience that come out of it. But I also think there's downstream effects that we are only beginning to measure. So that's sort of the kid aspect. I think should it be regulated? 100%. It has to be. I mean, and that'll be some part of the same narrative, right? And it was completely unregulated. It's going to be like early pharmaceutical stories. Like they could just make anything, give it to anybody, right? Same idea. This is real impactful stuff. It wires people differently, and it absolutely should be regulated for the individual user. And then not even to mention the societal impacts of allowing that to just run rampant. I don't want draconian controls on it, but we have to get our heads around the impact that it has and just have honest conversations.
Yeah, I mean, to say they aren't media companies at this point is, a spurious argument at best.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And there's all sorts of reasons to make that try to counter that argument, most of it financial.
Right.
But I also think there's a downside. Part of it, I guess, coming out of the military and the work. I mean, we've just been able to work with some amazing leaders in industry. One of the things I tell to my friends in uniform still, because they're like, what's the difference between the outside and inside and the real world versus military? And I say, well, I'll tell you what the similarities is. What keeps you in the military, the leaders you work for, right? Because that person's willing to do another deployment. I'll go with them, right? That sort of mentality, the person to your left and right. And I've said, look, there are the same quality and caliber of leaders in the private sector. they work just as hard, they care just as much about the mission and their people. So that you will be pleasantly surprised by what you encounter there. And so I think one of the sad parts from learning that in the corporate space has been, we've got this cluster of brilliant minds in the technology sector, and the history of how important the relationship between that part of our economy and our nation has been historically, from getting to the moon to the Hewlett and Packard deciding to start something. There's just always been this great synergy for the betterment of humankind, and now we're taking these brilliant minds, and just a depressing number of them are optimizing ad flow, right? Like, solve bigger problems. And I feel like they're just getting pigeonholed into the space. I totally understand why it happens, but it's a bad trend for our country. I want that level of brilliance solving bigger issues than figuring out how to optimize the algorithm that tells me what shoes to buy.
Yeah. Well, that's a great transition into what we call the lightning round, which is just kind of 1-2 sentence answers, stream of consciousness. The first one is, what's one technology that you think will dramatically accelerate the future of work?
Miniaturization and swarm technology. I mean, that's a very military biased answer, but I think that's the next order of magnitude shift on the battlefield.
That is super exciting. Chris, who's one person you follow closely on this kind of general topic of the future of work?
I'm a big fan of Peter Singer as a futurist in general. Writes a lot around government, military, and there's bridges over to industry and tech as well.
Interesting. Just writing that down so I can always follow up. That's one of the best things about doing this podcast, is that we have really smart people that always turn us on to really cool articles and things like that. Is there an article or a piece of research that's kind of fundamentally shifted your perspective on the future of work, Chris?
I think some of the social analysis that's come out of this is pre-COVID, but I think some of the economic data and what groups were most impacted over the last year sort of support the idea that we've created this sort of crazy treadmill to get to the 2%. The Atlantic had a series of great articles last year that they did some deep work there. New York Times has, et cetera. I think that's one of the areas that our generation in particular is only starting to understand, and something we have to adjust.
Chris, what's one sort of temporary change as a result of COVID that you think will become permanent?
Shift away from cities.
That is certainly, we're certainly seeing that here in the Bay Area. There has been an exodus out from what was before COVID an unsustainable society, frankly.
Yeah, I'll give you more than the lightning round answer. I don't think it's going to be, the cities aren't dead, right? They're still amazing places. Washington, D.C. is my favorite city in the world. My wife and I made a very conscious choice to relocate from there to the mountains of West Virginia for the foreseeable future. And there's a whole host of reasons behind that. But what we knew as a cities back in that sort of 2019 discussion, they're going to redesign themselves. It won't be that for a long, long time. And I think some of the people that were on that treadmill in that intense of an environment are going to say, wait a second, I can do this differently. I was joking with a friend yesterday. I'm like, a year ago, if a meeting ran long on Monday, I knew I was going to miss my train on Thursday. Like, it was that tightly wired. Yeah. And as we've had a little bit of time and space to think about it, I think we're going to rewire a lot of our behaviors.
Amen.
So, Chris, do you think, related to that, Silicon Valley on the way up or on the way down?
Silicon Valley's, I think of it as a community of practice rather than a place necessarily. It's got the smartest people in the country and in the world. It's going to be just fine. I think housing prices will adjust. I think how work gets done will adjust. But you got to be long on Silicon Valley because I'm long on people who are mission driven and smart, right? And it still has that.
Chris, it's funny. We love this question, and the answers are almost predictable. So people outside of the Valley basically give us your answer, and people in the Valley give us the opposite point of view. It's kind of fun.
That says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. And then I love to end on this one. This is a question from a famous contrarian that we're a big fan of, Peter Thiel. Chris, what's something you believe strongly that is an unpopular view today?
You matter less as a parent than you think. Every parent likes to think they're really important. I think you give them the guardrails, and they're going to do what they're going to do. Keep them from drowning and shooting each other.
It's funny. I just finished this book. I think it's a book about DNA and genetics. I can't remember the title of it, but the theme of the book is what you do as a parent matters, but it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, it's great, but it cuts at your core identity for some people. So,
well, it's depressing and emancipating all at once. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. This was an awesome conversation. We tackled some really interesting topics. Let everybody know where can they reach you? Where can they find out more about you and the firm?
So McChrystal Group, you can Google us, go to our website, learn all about our practice. And then we hang all our books in there as well. And I'm up on Fussell Chris on Twitter, and we push a lot of our thinking out there as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris.
Great to have you on. Thanks so much, Chris.
Great discussion. Appreciate it.